Remember when the Pelicans were trying to dump salary just to sign Kyle Lowry and then ended up with Devontae Graham? Or the Lonzo Ball trade? Or the DeMar DeRozan trade? Or the million other things that happened last offseason? That really does feel like 5 years ago. And so as a result, I want to look back on the 2021 offseason just 1 year later. Really quickly though, I want to thank the sponsor of today's video, Prize Picks. 1, 2, 3. Okay. And 1, 2, 3. I just won. Prize Picks is a great way to play player props, and there's really no bad time of the year to get into Prize Picks. They have so many different offerings, whether it be baseball, football future stuff, esports, whatever the case may be, it can all be found on Prize Picks. So how it works is you pick between 2 and 5 players, and you pick over or under for what you think their performance is going to be in a given game. And if you're correct, you win some cash. And I know a lot of you are basketball people like myself, so they've got the basketball tournament on there, they've got WNBA on there, but if you want to look at literally anything else you can think of, I'm sure Prize Picks has it covered. So Prize Picks is something you want to get into this summer, then I have an offer for you. When you use code SPORTING or you click the link in the description, Prize Picks will match 100% of your deposit up to $100. Again, when you use code SPORTING and you click the link in the description. I'm always curious to see what lineups you guys are putting together, so tag me on Twitter, let me know what you're doing over on Prize Picks, and thank you again to Prize Picks for sponsoring this video. And we begin with some of the contracts that were given out that offseason. Unfortunately, this first one is a big one, is the Michael Porter Jr. rookie max extension. And now having looked back on it a year later, he played 9 games this season, missed most of the year with a back injury, and that is a huge cause for concern, not only because the Nuggets need Michael Porter Jr. either as a trade piece or otherwise to really push themselves towards true contention status, but also the back injury stuff is something that he has dealt with for years, not just in college, but in high school as well. And so this is a huge concern for a guy that is making max money for the next like 4 or 5 seasons for Denver. And I personally think that this is now one of the worst contracts in the entire league. And honestly, you can kind of argue that that was the case at the time, given the injury history, given the medicals at the time of the draft that caused him to slip to the late lottery, and given the fact that he really, it's not like he was a super consistent or durable player up until that point, nor did he show like he's an all-star caliber player at the moment he signed it. It was truly an upside signing, and certainly a risky one now as we look back on it a year later, but he's not the only one that got a big number last offseason. We have other contracts like the Spencer Dinwiddie one. Spencer Dinwiddie, who is already now moved on to Dallas. Washington brought him in when he left the Nets to be kind of Bradley Beal's backcourt mate after they got rid of Russell Westbrook, who we're going to talk about later. And yeah, it didn't work. For some reason, the vibes just weren't there. People didn't get along with Spencer Dinwiddie, and they already moved his contract on to Dallas and got Kristaps Porzingis in exchange, also moving Davis Bertans to Dallas. Lowry Markanin also got himself a payday. He's not in the trade section, even though this is technically a sign and trade, because I want to talk about him here. It took a little while for him to really get kind of either the deal he was looking for or the market to truly develop for him as a restricted free agent, and he was one of many moves that the Bulls made last offseason, which we're going to talk about later. And I still, for some reason, kind of like Lowry Markanin. He's a part of that supersized lineup in Cleveland with Jared Allen and Evan Mobley, and he's a bit of a weird fit at times, but I still am intrigued by the upside and the shooting ability and the scoring ability of Lowry Markanin. And looking back now on that contract, I don't really hate it for Cleveland. We have some more here as well, maybe some slightly smaller ones, guys like Robert Williams, who got, I think, 4 years, 54. That looks like an absolute steal now if you're Boston, considering how important he was to them defensively and how good he was for them as well. Marcus Smart for Boston as well got a nice extension last offseason. Then we got some big ones though. Kawhi Leonard, Kevin Durant, and Julius Randle to varying degrees of success. We'll begin with Julius Randle. We've talked about this in other videos before. He made an All-NBA team and they gave him a max contract. Like, you can't really blame, or close to max, you can't really blame them for believing that Julius Randle was going to continue to be like at least an all-star caliber guy. But given the fact that he never made an All-NBA team before and it was a contract year, maybe there should have been some red flags that had gone up there. They gave him this huge deal and he was really disappointing this year. The jump shot wasn't there. He looked unhappy at times as well with the fans and with the organization, which is obviously a huge concern for an organization that needs good vibes in order to bring in, stars and superstars to their team. Maybe he'll turn it around. Maybe it was just a down year for him and he'll ultimately be worth the contract. But I know for a fact there are a lot of Knicks fans out there that are very concerned about what the team is going to be paying Julius Randle for the next couple of seasons. And then we've got the 2 max contracts, the big ones here. Kawhi, in Kevin Durant. Now, Kawhi didn't play at all this year. We're presuming he's going to continue to play over the next couple of seasons for the Clippers, but that took away like the doomsday scenario for the Clippers once Paul George re-signed and Kawhi re-signed. So there was no scenario where those guys were both going to leave and then they were going to have all these draft picks sent out and be in a really bad spot. And then the Kevin Durant one, an extension that at the time really didn't seem all that consequential. Like, it was obviously a big deal that he decided to return to Brooklyn, but at the time it was pretty much assumed that Harden was going to re-sign and that Kyrie was going to re-sign. And now obviously things are very, very much up in the air. And if you think about what the landscape of the offseason right now would look like if Kevin Durant had never signed that extension, it would be dramatically different because he had a player option. Like, Kevin Durant could have been a free agent right now if he didn't sign that 4-year extension last offseason with Brooklyn. And as a Brooklyn fan, thank goodness he signed the extension, because otherwise we'd be looking at basically the KG, Paul Pierce trade all over again, where those guys all end up leaving for basically nothing. At least in this scenario, hopefully either those guys come back, those guys being Kyrie and KD, or they can get some pretty good value in exchange for Kevin Durant. And now we move on to one of the more interesting parts of every offseason for me, the trades. The biggest one here, we have to start here, it is the Russell Westbrook deal. And you can go back and look. I was on record at the time, the moment the Russell Westbrook trade happened, that it was an L for the Lakers, that I didn't like the move, that it didn't make any sense to me, that I would have rather had Buddy Hield and kept KCP on the roster, whatever the structure was, rather than bringing in Russell Westbrook. And I had all these people yelling at me, oh my gosh, Tuck, what are you talking about? Like, Russ is going to be amazing. This guy averages triple doubles. It increases their star power. He's going to be great alongside LeBron. He's going to take the pressure off LeBron offensively. Okay, cool. But what about when you need to be at your best? Like, the idea of Russell Westbrook helping their bench unit and being a guy that can run second units and take some of the pressure off of LeBron offensively, that made sense to me. But what about when you need to be at your peak, when you need all 5 pieces on the floor to fit and to work well together? What happens then? We still were giving him a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, thinking maybe this will be the year that he turns it around, figures out a way to be like a role player star, figures out a way to cut off the ball, be active and engaged defensively, and try and limit some of those spacing concerns that he causes on the offensive end of the floor. But spoiler alert, that didn't happen. He was the same old Russ, and 3-man lineups including LeBron, AD, and Russ, 2-man lineups including Russ and LeBron, 2-man lineups including Russ and AD, Russ by himself with bench guys. None of those lineups worked. It was a complete and utter disaster. And this is honestly, considering where the Lakers were in the 2020 bubble to where they are now, one of the worst trades of the last 10 years. It's a really, really tough one for the Lakers. Next up, we have the Kyle Lowry sign-in trade, which was a really big story of the offseason last year because there were a lot of teams kind of positioning themselves to try and bring in Kyle Lowry, as we talked about in the intro, the Pelicans being one of them. Ultimately, he ends up in Miami, and I would say this has been a disappointing move so far for Miami, given his lack of availability, I should say, in the postseason, where he hasn't been healthy, hasn't really looked good, and now you're looking at that contract, the fact that he's like 35 years old, and you're thinking, my goodness, was this actually like a pretty big mistake? I mean, they gave up like Goran Dragic and Precious Achiuwa. I like Precious Achiuwa, and I understand the upside of it. It's not like Dragic was great this year, and they had an opportunity to upgrade the guard spot. I understand that, but that could end up being like a pretty bad contract for them over the next couple of seasons. And I don't think that was really what they had anticipated when they brought in Kyle Lowry in the first place. They probably thought that the first year of Lowry would be pretty good, and he's already kind of breaking down. We'll see. Maybe they'll turn it around this year. Maybe he'll be healthy and be really important for them. But as it was the case for pretty much the entire Miami roster this year, injuries were a big issue. And then, as I talked about a little bit in the intro, we have the Pelicans thing, basically, where they were trying to get Kyle Lowry. They didn't. They got Devontae Graham. They gave up a first. They basically dumped Lonzo for nothing. And I clowned them for it at the time because I liked Lonzo. I thought he was a really good fit alongside Zion and Brandon Ingram. And things have turned around here for the Pelicans. They brought in CJ McCollum. They look like an interesting sleeper team this coming season. They've got plenty of trade assets. Brandon Ingram looks great. Zion signed the extension. But really, the interesting part of this is Lonzo, I don't really know what to think about the medical stuff with Lonzo right now. The knee injury stuff does not look fantastic. And not that the Pelicans were like hoping for Lonzo to get hurt. Certainly, I think we all want Lonzo to be healthy and be good for Chicago. But when you look back on that now in terms of the value Lonzo might provide to Chicago moving forward, the Pelicans came out okay in this one, actually, despite the fact that myself, as well as a lot of other people, really didn't like the moves. And then last up, speaking of Chicago, the DeMar DeRozan trade. This was... I don't know if this was like an L for me in terms of a take at the time, but I think a lot of people just aren't DeMar DeRozan people, myself included. And I don't I'd be pretty surprised if there was anybody out there last offseason saying that DeMar DeRozan was going to have an MVP level season and that the trade was a huge win for Chicago. I think there are some people out there that liked the value, not having to give up too much in exchange for DeMar. I didn't love the contract number for him. I thought that was an absolutely massive number considering what the market seemed to be for him, considering that there weren't a lot of other teams that seriously were considering bringing him in on that kind of number. I mean, there were rumors about the Lakers trying to get this guy in the mid-level exception, and Chicago's handing out $25+ million deals to the guy. But ultimately, the fit alongside Zach LaVine was actually really good, and he was an MVP caliber player. Now, they fell apart in the second half of the season a lot due to injuries. Patrick Williams was a key piece for them. He got hurt early. Caruso was in and out of the lineup. Lonzo, same thing. And there's some interesting pieces on the Chicago roster, and if they're fully healthy this coming season, which I think is a big if considering the Lonzo stuff, they could be really, really good. A lot of that as a result of bringing in DeMar DeRozan last offseason. Now Zach LaVine has re-signed as well. And this is a really interesting deal to look back on now, considering Chicago's kind of pushed a lot of their chips to the middle of the table unless they want to start trading away Patrick Williams. And they're arguably not even one of the 5 best teams in the Eastern Conference right now. But in terms of value, like, they didn't really give up a ton for DeMar, and he had a borderline MVP caliber season. And even if you don't love the number like me, maybe you don't love his play style like me, he was awesome this year. You have to give them full credit for that. And that is the 2021 NBA offseason 1 year later.